Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by the Logitech G935 headset.
Nearly 10 years after its initial release in 2010, it is now possible to experience that cornerstone PS3 release, Heavy Rain from Quantic Dreams on PC, albeit just on the Epic Games Store currently. Heavy Rain made its first splashes as a work-in-progress title with a demo snippet in the run-up to the launch of the PS3, showcasing rather next-gen character technology for that time. While that casting demo definitely made waves in 2006, in the post-Crisis and Uncharted 2 world of 2010, Heavy Rain did not make as much of a splash for its technology as it might have otherwise. The game, though, did develop a cult following of sorts for a variety of reasons, and is known for its craft and the great level of detail put into its individual scenes, even if that original PS3 version showcased some frame dips and screen tearing. Fast forward to 2015, and Heavy Rain was remastered and re-released on the PlayStation 4, with my colleague John Linneman diving into the version differences at that time. It was then clocking in at a healthy 1920 by 1080 above 720p of that PS3 original, with a steady 30 FPS frame rate, up-res textures, shadows, and updated post-processing like screen space ambient occlusion being added. The game finally had a version that allowed it to come more visually close to its filmic ambitions. For me, it was quite the surprise to learn that this would not be the final time that we see Heavy Rain. As announced earlier in May this year, PC versions of Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and Detroit Become Human will be releasing to PC, with exclusivity on the Epic Games Store. As I see it, this is an incredibly exciting opportunity. Quantic Dreams games have always been very ambitious in terms of their technology on their respective platforms, especially in regards to character rendering. And being able to have those historical, technological advances cataloged for eternity on PC with Heavy Rain or Beyond Two Souls brings a smile to my face. And we will also soon be able to untether Detroit Become Human from its console shackles, where we will be able to see some of the best of modern character rendering and otherwise at native 4K and even higher. So my hopes are high that these ports can offer up a quality that these games deserve. But is that the case here with this PC version of Heavy Rain, or is it more of a wash? Well, after getting into the main menu and starting the game after boosting the game's graphics to max, I was actually a bit nervous that this wouldn't be the case. My on-screen display was strangely larger than usual, and the menu text looks suitably HD, a mix of 720p and 1080p elements. That and the initial real-time rendered origami thing looked to be updating at half of my 60Hz refresh rate at 4K. Furthermore, something didn't appear right in the game graphics themselves, which looked a bit smudgier and aliased in comparison to what an Ultra HD 4K version of the game should look like. So I spent some time doing something I almost never do on PC, and I pixel counted my initial capture, and then I found out the game was actually internally rendering at 1440p, even though I had selected 3840 by 2160 in the menu. Really odd behavior that had me dreading that we had perhaps another Dark Souls kind of situation on hand. Hoping to be wrong, I went back in the game and flipped back and forth the resolutions again, back up to 4K. This time, the game actually looked to be rendering at 4K, and a quick pixel count confirmed that. So the game has some minor toothing and compatibility issues on start, perhaps. So if your game starts up looking a bit lower resolution than you imagine it should, adjust your resolution again and restart the game. This is where my first gripe comes in, actually. Resolution is handled generally differently than other games might do it, and a bit more like Deus Ex Mankind Divided, if you've ever played that. Here you can choose between borderless or full screen, but they act the same in my experience, where the game internally scales up your chosen resolution to your desktop display resolution. So choosing the game to be 1080p on a 4K display will scale up from 1080p internally to your 4K desktop resolution. This is a positive thing because it means an internal scaling option, which I always like. But it's also negative because it requires your desktop to be downsampled for downsampling to work, and you can unwittingly lock yourself out of choosing the proper refresh rate that you wish to be actually using, like how my display has 120Hz available at 1440p, but not at 4K. So if you wanted to use 120Hz, you would also have to have your desktop resolution set to one that is capable of 120Hz. But that doesn't mean you would necessarily see 120 FPS in game. Higher than 60 FPS is not actually natively supported in the game options here, due to the frame rate lock of 30 or 60 being the only available options. To fully unlock the game's frame rate up to your chosen refresh rate on your desktop, you have to tweak the game files. Here I followed the handy advice as cataloged on the ever useful PC Gaming Wiki. Go into the config file, change both vertical sync options to 0, and load up the game again utilizing VSync, for example, from your graphics control panel. And this generally works surprisingly well in my experience. Yep, you can enjoy every yell of Jason or Sean at 120Hz or higher should you so wish.
Jason! Jason!
But your CPU has to be up to that task. While this is a nice x86 port of a PS3 title and is suitably multi-threaded, you will really need that single core speed to really keep this at a consistent 120 FPS or higher, something that a Ryzen 1700X at stock clocks was not at all able to reliably do in my experience, falling often under 120 FPS and even 60 FPS, which is something I'll come back to later. A Core i5-8400, on the other hand, had little to no trouble keeping the game above 120 FPS. Although I didn't notice any bugs from unlocking the frame rate, the developers at Quantic Dream did not just arbitrarily leave these menu options to 30 or 60. Most likely this ancient PS3 release has some high frame rate induced bugs, so perhaps do not tempt fate and keep the game at 60 FPS. It is a very low interactivity game after all. Even without a high frame rate, 60 FPS is a wonderful upgrade over the console versions of the past, and is in fact the greatest differentiator between the PS4 and PC versions of the game at first glance. Animations are just so much smoother than that PS4 release when you see them at 60 FPS. Since this game has no per object or camera motion blur, any bit of extra smoothness really helps. As I say that though, not everything's perfect at 60 FPS, as there are some relics of that console release there. Sometimes it would appear that the camera movement in some scenes looks to be 30 FPS, for example, like in the opening here, or some animations are keyed to only display at 30, like the windshield wipers in the car here, which look noticeably jerky while the rest of the scene is smooth, or how the rain patter in the opening menu is 30 FPS, but is actually rendering completely at 60. These artifacts are few and far between though, and never game-breaking. It's just the legacy of a game fully designed around being 30 FPS. With the ability to play the game at 60 FPS being the greatest point of differentiation between this version on PC and the PS4 version, some of you might be disappointed in hearing that. But honestly, it's not too much different than many last-gen ports available on PC in that regard. Many games in the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation offered up only higher frame rates and resolutions usually. And resolution thankfully here is not a problem, unlike my first impressions led me to believe. When putting the game running on a PS4 Pro next to the game running on an RTX 2080 Ti at maxed in-game settings at 4K 60 FPS, there are of course other benefits to mention. The game never ended up getting patched on PS4 Pro, so it's still 1080p 30 as the original PS4 release was, and increasing the resolution over that in this case has its best effects on the outer edges of most objects, like thin handrails or long reflective edges, areas where the original PS4 release's anti-aliasing could not prevent a dancing of pixels. Likewise, since the game makes heavy use of planar reflections, increasing the resolution of the entire viewport also has the knock-on effect of keeping the edges found in those planar reflections looking more stable, which once again otherwise kind of dance around on base 1080p of the PS4 version. Increasing the resolution to 4K or higher greatly stabilizes edges, of course, but those are not the only other methods to go above that PS4 version and keeping edges smooth. In-game, you also have access to multi-sample anti-aliasing and separate post-process anti-aliasing options in FXAA or SMAA. Funnily enough, even when sifting and comparing all the possible 12 anti-aliasing combinations, I just couldn't put my finger on what type of anti-aliasing we were looking at here on PS4. The game looked more stable with 8 times MSAA on PC, but not in a manner to make me conclusively say the PS4 was not using some lower form of MSAA. Given that confounding factor, I just asked Quantic Dreams themselves directly, and they clarified it in a very nice way. PS4 is just using standard FXAA in Heavy Rain, with no multi-sample anti-aliasing at all, leaving the image a bit raw and unstable on long edges. MSAA on its own does offer tangible benefits in this game, being a forward-rendered game. You can see noticeably more stable geometric edges as you push that quality up from 0 to 8x. Its performance cost at 1080p, for example, on a GTX 1060 was rather reasonable, costing 12% of total performance at 2x, 16% at 4x, and around 29% performance at 8x MSAA at 1080p. In the end here though, I don't actually have a recommended setting for MSAA, as the choice is yours. You do get a more stable image in the end with MSAA for its reasonable performance costs, but you may prefer utilizing that performance for a higher resolution. The last real tangible settings upgrade over PlayStation 4 on PC is the choice to turn ambient occlusion off, use HDAO or HBAO. When putting it in a direct comparison to that PS4 version, one can see that the HDAO looks to be the closest visual analog to the PS4 version. But at the same time, even HDAO is a bit less halo-y. The PS4 version seems to have outlines surrounding many objects regardless of their actual world position. HBAO in comparison to HDAO eliminates that halo more often than not while still adding in ambient shade. Just not too much of it to the point where characters look like they have dirt on their faces. So I would consider the use of HBAO here to be an upgrade, even if it does provide a slightly different look in scenes. But that's really where the upgrades of the PlayStation 4 version end. Every other direct comparison I have done puts the PS4 at the highest equivalent settings as found on PC for textures, reflections, and model quality. But not everything can actually be matched to that PS4 version, even if you try. There are some odd discrepancies here, like how you can see here on the balcony of the opening scene. In this scene, the textures on the balcony look to not have any bitmaps on PS4, making them stay ultra sharp into the distance and alias much more on movement. In fact, that texture looks rather different. PC, on the other hand, looks to use bitmaps here, having the advantage of having less inner edge aliasing, but at the same time, it doesn't scale up with resolution changes above 1080p, so that texture keeps its lower resolution look into the distance even if there's a higher resolution to compensate for that potential aliasing effect. Curiously, this art change is completely one-off. I could only see this difference in this opening scene of the game. Other scenes did not showcase this discrepancy. But that's not the only difference. It is easy to note in these direct comparisons here that the level of bloom showcased on PC, at least as I'm showing it, is decidedly less than found on PS4. PS4 blooms out to white in many areas of this opening scene, for example, while the PC version has more saturated colors and almost lacks that bloom altogether. Very strange indeed, but remember how I mentioned that the game automatically upscales to your desktop resolution from that internal resolution? Well, if you play the game at 1080p even, but have your desktop set to 4K, that internal upscaling process from 1080p to 4K of the viewport has an effect on bloom, and it essentially kills it. This happens even though you're technically rendering at the same native internal resolution as the PS4 version. But if you have your desktop set to native resolution 1080p and in-game as well to 1080p, well then the size and shape of bloom is the exact same as it is on the PS4 version. So this is essentially an oversight, and hopefully can be fixed. It's not the first time that we have seen a title from this generation of consoles having strange post-processing behavior the higher or lower resolution it is. And there's also some other completely unexplainable differences. For some unknown reason, for example, Sean's model in these opening cutscenes looks a tiny bit different on PC. Not worse, just a tiny bit different placement of geometry, which actually does not align at all with changing the model quality setting. Or like here, where for some unknown reason, Sean's shoes in the second chapter of Ethan's story have a color change to the PS4 version. Is this some sort of riddle, some sort of breadcrumb trail leading us to the actual identity of the origami killer? I have no idea, but there's some slight artwork differences that have popped up in this port. Intentional or not, they're there. So PS4 looks like PC's highest settings with a different type of AO and no MSAA. Usually I would base my recommended settings based on those found in the Pro Console versions of the game, but this is a PS3 port. So the optimized settings for a modern PC are really just to push everything up to the highest level as you desire, which for any modern GPU is probably going to be around 4K or a bit lower if you leave multi-sample anti-aliasing to reasonable levels or leave it off. For example, the RTX 2080 Ti can play this game easily at 4K 60 FPS with 8 times MSAA and SMAA while barely even needing to go up to full clocks. And it doesn't even utilize 50% of the GPU more often than not. It has no issues at all. Looking at more reasonably priced components with everything set to high, utilizing SMAA and no MSAA, the GTX 1060 finds itself just occasionally a tick underneath 60 FPS at 4K in gameplay. It will actually spend a majority of its time at 60 in gameplay. Just small bursts of alpha effects such as rain or something slightly more complex may cause drops into the 50s. Unfortunately for mid-range GPUs, this game can have extremely different load based upon its usage of multiple viewports, such as in the opening scene. These cause the game to render many objects multiple times over as it shows a different view, and this has a proportional hit with each and every extra viewport that shows up on screen. While the gameplay may be a near 4K 60 FPS on a GTX 1060, scenes such as the opening one may see dips far lower, which then stabilize to 60 FPS as soon as all those multiple viewports disappear. The RX 580 here performs very similar but a bit faster than that GTX 1060, seeing little to no drops in gameplay at all, but still suffering in those moments when multiple viewports enter the fray. Even dropping down to 1440p with no MSAA on a GTX 1060 will see that opening cutscene dropping FPS as all those viewports are rendered. My recommendation for mid-range GPU users is to kind of ignore these scenes as they're non-interactive usually. It is best to take advantage of the high quality frame rate above consoles as much as possible for gameplay sequences, and to push up the resolution as high as you can or push up MSAA as high as you can. For a GTX 1060, this would mean a custom resolution or DSR resolution below 4K with no AA. Or something like 1440p with 8 times MSAA with FXAA or SMAA, which is something I actually prefer. Here I would offer up the same recommendation for the RX 580 as well, but that's just the GPU side of things, where not many GPUs will be prevented from hitting 60 FPS. Rather, the biggest factor getting in the way of a proper 60 FPS is the game itself coupled with your CPU. Occasionally, and definitely not consistently, the game will drop frames from 60 FPS when transitioning a camera or when moving from room to room. It's not a deal breaker, I would say, but it's something that's able to be seen. The bigger problem I actually have is that frame rate drops can occur when multiple inner thought text options pop up on screen. Here your FPS can go from a steady 60 FPS to a middling 50s or something, or even down to the 40s momentarily, just because multiple of these inner thought prompts have come up on screen. Though, this does not happen on every and any CPU. For example, the Core i5-8400 did not have this problem at all. Rather, this issue is just localized to the Ryzen 1700X machine I tested the game on. Either this is an engine issue with Ryzen itself, or some specific limitation of Ryzen, as differences in single-threaded performance, as I've come to expect here, do not account for this oddness. The last thing to mention with the game is how it controls. A lot of the game's motion control segments from PS4 or PS3 are translated into thumbstick flicks or depressions of the keyboard or movement of the mouse. I always felt this game's more interesting story and little detective moments were bogged down in the tedium of having to do those controller shakes and spins. And now in their more simplified form, I found myself more immersed in the story, as mundane actions did not require me to think about my hand movements as such. So here, a feature being removed from most input devices for your average controller is actually a plus. And that's where we're left off here with this PC version. The PC version of Heavy Rain is going to be the way the game will stand the test of time, and is currently in a good position to fulfill that destiny. It looks better than the PS4 version and has the benefits of 60 FPS, or even higher if you wish to tempt fate. The age of the game also means it runs incredibly well on almost any machine out there now. At the same time, it's imperfect for those seeking that exact same look of the PS4 version before it. The game really only needs one patch or two to clear up that spotty rise in performance and that bloom size scaling issue that I mentioned earlier. If those issues are cleared up, then we will have an amazing version of this PS3 classic, and hopefully the quality of this port reflects on Quantic Dreams' other games coming shortly to the Epic Games Store. Actually, I did want to take a look at the Beyond Two Souls demo available currently for this video, but the Epic Games Store keeps showing me this error on all the PCs I've tried to access it on. So I guess I will leave my impressions of that game for another video in the future. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this video on Heavy Rain's PC version. If you did enjoy it, well, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to talk to me about this game or anything else really, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
Oh, yeah, Jason, tell me what you want to be when you grow up.
I don't know. Maybe a fireman or an astronaut. Oh, wait, I know. I'll be a dinosaur hunter.
I am Jason!
Featuring 2.4 GHz wireless, 50mm Pro G audio drivers, and DTS Headphone X 2.0 surround sound technology under the hood, the G935 headset delivers the ultimate wireless audio solution for gamers, whether you're playing on PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, or mobile. Order yours today from Logitech G.